Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Clockmaker's Daughter. The bell above the shop door chimed, a gentle yet precise sound, resonating in the quiet air like a perfectly tuned note. Eleanor Whitaker, a creature of habit and subtle curiosity, stepped into the dim, time-worn shop, her shoes clicking softly on the tiled floor. She hadn't planned to visit. It was one of those serendipitous moments when the world seemed to guide her feet before her mind could catch up. The shop smelled of polished wood and brass, with a faint trace of lavender, as if time itself had been distilled into a fragrance. The walls were lined with clocks of every imaginable size and style. Grandfather clocks with their ornate carvings, tiny pocket watches gleaming under the glass, and intricate cuckoo clocks that seemed to whisper secrets in their stillness. Behind the counter stood a man who didn't immediately notice her. He was hunched over a workbench, his fingers deftly adjusting the gears of an antique timepiece. His hands moved with an elegance that belied their strength, each motion deliberate, as though he could hear the heartbeat of the mechanism. "Excuse me," Eleanor ventured, her voice breaking the trance-like silence. The man looked up, startled. His eyes were a piercing green, like sunlight filtering through forest leaves, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with tousled dark hair and a smudge of oil on his cheek. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice warm and smooth like the hum of a perfectly wound clock. He wiped his hands on a rag, leaving faint streaks of gold dust on his fingers. "What can I help you with?" Eleanor hesitated, suddenly unsure why she had come. "I was just curious. Your shop caught my eye." "Curiosity is a fine reason to step into a clockmaker's world," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm Adrian. And you?" "Eleanor," she replied, feeling a strange sense of relief at sharing her name with him. Adrian stepped around the counter, his movements graceful, as if he were in sync with the rhythm of the ticking clocks. He gestured toward a display case near the window. "Each of these clocks has a story. Some are centuries old, their makers long gone, but their craft lives on." Eleanor leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. One clock, a delicate silver pocket watch, caught her attention. Its face was etched with tiny constellations, and the hands glowed faintly, as if touched by starlight. "This one," she said, pointing to it. Adrian's expression softened. "Ah, the celestial dial. It's said to show not just the time, but the moments in life that truly matter." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Moments in life that matter? That sounds like something out of a fairy tale." "Perhaps," Adrian said, his smile deepening. "But every fairy tale has a grain of truth, don't you think?" As he spoke, a soft chime sounded from the celestial dial. Eleanor felt a peculiar sensation, as though time had slowed for just a heartbeat. She blinked and shook her head, dismissing the feeling as imagination. Over the next hour, Adrian told her stories of the clocks in his shop, of lovers separated by war, reunited by a pocket watch that survived the trenches, of an inventor who poured his unspoken love into a clock for the woman who never knew his feelings. Eleanor listened, captivated by his words and the quiet passion in his voice. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows in the shop grew long, Eleanor noticed something strange. The clocks had stopped ticking, all of them. The silence was profound, a void that pressed against her chest. Adrian's face grew serious. "You should leave now, Eleanor," he said softly. "What? Why?" she asked, a shiver running down her spine. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped behind the counter and picked up the celestial dial, holding it out to her. "Take this. It's yours now." "I don't understand," Eleanor stammered. "I can't take this. It must be priceless." Adrian's green eyes locked onto hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't name. "It's not about the price. It's about what it will show you. Trust me, Eleanor." Before she could protest further, he pressed the watch into her hand. The moment her fingers closed around it, the world seemed to tilt. The shop dissolved into a blur of light and shadow, and a strange melodic ticking filled her ears. When she blinked, she was standing in the middle of a bustling street. Not the quiet cobblestone lane where the clock shop had been, but a city she didn't recognize. The air was electric with life, and the people around her moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Eleanor looked down at the celestial dial in her hand. Its hands spun wildly, then stopped, pointing to a specific time, 8:32 p.m. A voice behind her made her whirl around. It was Adrian, but he looked different, older, wearier, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't place. "You found the moment," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. "What moment?" Eleanor demanded. "What's happening?" Adrian hesitated, then took a step closer. "The celestial dial doesn't just show time, it shows fate, and yours is about to change forever." Chapter 2. The Moment That Changes Everything. The city buzzed around Eleanor, but her world felt eerily still. Adrian stood before her, his gaze piercing yet sorrowful, as though he carried the weight of countless untold stories. Her grip on the celestial dial tightened, the cool metal grounding her in the midst of chaos. "What do you mean, fate?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharper now, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "And why do you look older?" Adrian's expression softened. "Time doesn't flow the same way for everyone, Eleanor. This watch, has pulled you into a moment that matters, one where you'll make a choice that shapes your future. My role is simply to guide you." Her brow furrowed. "A guide? You were a clockmaker an hour ago." "I still am," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "But I'm also more. You'll understand soon." Before she could press him further, the celestial dial began to glow faintly in her hand, its hands shifting to 8:32 p.m. once more. The street around her blurred and dimmed, like the fading edges of a dream, until only two figures stood out in sharp relief, a young man and a woman under a street lamp, their faces partially obscured by the shadow it cast. Eleanor felt a strange pull toward them, like gravity urging her forward. "Who are they?" she whispered. Adrian stepped beside her, his presence a steadying force. "They're connected to you. This moment is tied to something you've long forgotten, or perhaps never truly knew." The young man leaned closer to the woman, his voice just loud enough for Eleanor to catch fragments of their conversation. "You can't leave like this," he said, desperation lacing his words. "Not without giving us a chance." The woman's voice trembled. "It's not that simple, Marcus. You know why I have to go." Eleanor's chest tightened, though she didn't understand why. The scene felt achingly familiar, as though she'd lived it in another lifetime. Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Watch closely." The celestial dial began to chime softly in her hand, and the scene shifted again. This time, Eleanor was no longer an observer, but standing just a few feet away from Marcus and the woman. She could see their faces now. Marcus had piercing blue eyes and a jaw set with determination, while the woman bore an uncanny resemblance to herself. Eleanor's breath caught. "Is that me?" Adrian nodded, his expression unreadable. "A version of you, one that made a different choice." Her heart pounded as the realization hit her. She wasn't just watching a scene, she was confronting a fork in her own timeline. The other Eleanor, this alternate version of herself, had made a choice that rippled through time, creating a future entirely separate from her own. "What choice did she make?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "She chose love, but love doesn't come without sacrifice." The scene around them shifted again, fast-forwarding through moments like a film on rewind. Eleanor saw glimpses of the other version of herself with Marcus, laughing, arguing, building a life together. But the happiness was tinged with shadows. A hospital room, a tear-streaked face, a goodbye that seemed to echo through eternity. The vision ended abruptly, and Eleanor was back in the bustling city, the celestial dial quiet in her hand. "Why are you showing me this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Adrian's eyes softened with compassion. "Because you're standing at the same crossroad, Eleanor. Tonight, you'll meet someone, or perhaps re-meet someone, and the choice you make will shape your life. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. Every path comes with its own joys and sorrows. There is no perfect answer." Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of emotions. She had always believed in the power of choice, but this was different. This was destiny, laid bare before her. The celestial dial began to glow once more, its hands spinning wildly before settling on a new time, 9:15 p.m. Eleanor looked at Adrian, panic rising in her chest. "What happens at 9:15? Adrian hesitated, then reached out to touch her hand, his touch warm and steady. You'll meet him, Marcus, or the person who could be him in your world. Eleanor's heart pounded as the weight of his words settled over her. But what if I'm not ready? What if I make the wrong choice? Adrian smiled faintly. There are no wrong choices, Eleanor. Only paths you haven't walked yet. The city began to blur again, the edges of reality dissolving into light and sound. Adrian's voice grew distant as he stepped back into the shadows. Remember, time isn't fixed. It bends to the choices we make. Trust yourself. Eleanor blinked, and when her vision cleared, she was standing outside a cafe, the warm glow of its light spilling onto the sidewalk. She glanced at the celestial dial in her hand. It was 9:14 p.m. The door to the cafe opened, and a man stepped out. His eyes met hers, and the world seemed to hold its breath. It was Marcus. Or was it? How do you feel about this twist? The stranger. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man before her wasn't quite the Marcus she'd seen in the vision. His hair was slightly longer, his features softer, yet there was something unmistakably familiar about him. His eyes held the same intensity, a quiet storm that made her feel as though he could see right through her. Sorry, he said, stepping aside to avoid her path. His voice, rich and steady, sent a shiver down her spine. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. The celestial dial in her hand warmed, a gentle pulse that seemed to nudge her forward. She hesitated, then took a step closer. Do I know you? She blurted out, immediately regretting how cliché it sounded. The man blinked, caught off guard, but then chuckled softly. I don't think so. Should I? No, I mean, she faltered, clutching the watch tighter. You just seem familiar. He tilted his head, studying her with a curious smile. Funny, I was just about to say the same thing. I'm Oliver, by the way. Eleanor's heart raced as she shook his hand. His touch was warm, grounding her in a moment that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Eleanor, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The cafe door opened behind them, spilling laughter and the scent of freshly brewed coffee onto the street. Oliver glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. I was just grabbing a coffee to go, but if you're not in a rush, care to join me? The question hung in the air, simple yet weighted. Eleanor glanced at the celestial dial. It was still warm, its hands now pointing to 9:16. The choice was hers. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. They found a quiet table near the window, where the soft hum of conversation provided a comforting backdrop. Oliver spoke easily, sharing snippets about his work as a freelance illustrator and his recent move to the city. Eleanor listened, her initial nerves giving way to a strange sense of ease, as though they'd known each other for years. What about you? He asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. What brings you here tonight? Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to explain the bizarre series of events that had led her to this moment. I wandered in, she said vaguely. Sometimes life takes you places you didn't plan on. Oliver nodded, his smile thoughtful. I know the feeling. Sometimes those unplanned moments turn out to be the best ones. As they talked, Eleanor felt the weight of the celestial dial in her pocket, a silent reminder of the choice she was making. She thought of Adrian's words. Every path comes with its own joys and sorrows. Hours seemed to pass in an instant. They laughed over shared stories, exchanged favorite books and films, and discovered an uncanny number of coincidences in their lives. By the time the cafe began to close, Eleanor realized she didn't want the night to end. Do you believe in fate? She asked suddenly as they stepped out into the crisp night air. Oliver raised an eyebrow, his smile playful. That's a big question for a first meeting. I mean it, she insisted. Do you think we're meant to meet certain people at certain times? He considered her question for a moment, his expression serious. I think we meet people for a reason, even if we don't always understand it right away. Sometimes they teach us something, or change our lives in ways we couldn't predict. Eleanor's heart skipped. The celestial dial pulsed again, its faint warmth reassuring. As they stood under the street lamp, Oliver hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small sketchbook. Before we go, he said, can I show you something? She nodded, intrigued. He flipped through the pages until he found a sketch, a portrait of a woman. Her hair fell in soft waves, her eyes wide with wonder. It was unmistakably Eleanor. Her breath caught. When? When did you draw this? Oliver looked sheepish. A few weeks ago. I dreamt about you. I thought it was just my imagination. But then, here you are. The world seemed to tilt. Eleanor clutched the celestial dial, its glow brighter now, as if urging her to see what lay before her. I don't know what this means, she whispered, her voice trembling. Neither do I, Oliver admitted, stepping closer. But maybe we don't need to. Maybe we just see where this goes. The choice was hers, the weight of possibility heavy yet thrilling. Chapter 4. The Echo of the Dial. The night stretched on, its quiet stillness punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Eleanor's heart raced as she stared at the sketch in Oliver's hands, her own reflection gazing back at her from the page. It was more than a coincidence, too precise, too real to ignore. I don't understand, Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible. How could you dream about me before we met? Oliver looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. I don't know, he admitted. It's like I've been waiting for this moment without even realizing it. The celestial dial in her pocket pulsed again, its warmth spreading through her fingertips. Eleanor hesitated, then made a decision. There's something I need to show you, she said, pulling the watch out and placing it on the table between them. The faint glow of its hands seemed to cast an otherworldly light over their faces. Oliver leaned in, his brow furrowing. What is it? It's called the Celestial Dial, she explained. It's not just a watch. It's tied to moments. Important ones. Moments that can change everything. Oliver looked up at her, searching her face for answers. Are you saying this watch led you to me? Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. And I think it led you to me, too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the revelation hung between them like the ticking of an invisible clock. Oliver reached out, his fingers brushing against the watch. The moment he touched it, the air around them seemed to shift. A soft chime rang out, clear and melodic, and the world dissolved into light. Eleanor blinked, shielding her eyes as the cafe melted away, replaced by a familiar scene, the clockmaker's shop. But this time, it wasn't empty. Adrian stood at his workbench, his hands steady as he adjusted the gears of another watch. He looked up, unsurprised to see them. Ah, you've brought him, Adrian said, a faint smile playing on his lips. Brought me where? Oliver asked, his voice tinged with awe and confusion. To the source, Adrian replied. Every story has a beginning. This is yours. Eleanor stepped forward, clutching the celestial dial. What's happening, Adrian? Why does Oliver have a connection to this? Adrian gestured toward the walls, where countless clocks ticked in perfect harmony. Time isn't a straight line, Eleanor. It twists and turns, connecting people in ways they can't always see. The celestial dial chose you because your paths were always meant to cross. But why me? Oliver asked, his voice steady despite the strangeness of the moment. I don't even understand what this is. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze intent. Because you're part of her choice. The watch doesn't just show moments. It reveals what could be. You've seen glimpses of each other, echoes of what might have been, because the two of you are tied to a decision that will ripple through time. Eleanor's breath hitched. What kind of decision? Adrian turned to her, his expression somber. The choice to stay or to walk away, to embrace the unknown with all its joys and sorrows, or to let it pass and live a simpler, safer life. Oliver looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with questions. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like I'm supposed to be here, with you. The celestial dial glowed brighter, its hands spinning rapidly before stopping at a time. 11:59 p.m. Adrian stepped back, his form fading into the shadows of the shop. The moment is yours now. Choose wisely. The world shifted again, and Eleanor found herself back on the street with Oliver. The city was quiet, the street lamps casting a soft glow over the pavement. She glanced at the celestial dial. It was almost midnight. Oliver broke the silence, his voice gentle but firm. Eleanor, whatever this is, whatever it means, I don't want to walk away from it. From you. But it's your choice too. Her mind raced, memories of the alternate version of herself flashing before her eyes. The laughter, the love, the heartbreak. She thought of Adrian's words, the weight of possibility pressing against her chest. The celestial dial chimed softly, its sound clear and melodic. Eleanor met Oliver's gaze, her heart pounding. Then let's see where this takes us. She reached for his hand, and as their fingers intertwined, the celestial dial grew warm in her pocket. Time seemed to pause, the stars above them shimmering with a strange, radiant energy. Somewhere, deep in the heart of the universe, a new path unfurled, weaving their lives together in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. The clock struck midnight. Chapter 5. The Path Unfolds. The street lay silent, the world holding its breath as Eleanor and Oliver stood hand in hand. The faint glow of the celestial dial faded, leaving behind a strange, comforting warmth that seemed to settle in Eleanor's chest. She glanced at Oliver, whose expression mirrored her own mix of awe and uncertainty. "So," Oliver began, his voice cutting through the quiet, "is this where we find out what happens next?" Eleanor smiled, the tension easing just enough to let a laugh escape. "I guess that depends on what we do now." Oliver looked around, as if the city itself might offer a clue. Then he turned back to her, his eyes steady and clear. "How about we start simple? A walk. No magic watches or mysterious guides. Just us." Eleanor nodded, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "I'd like that." They wandered through the city streets, the night folding around them like a blanket. The usual hum of life seemed distant, as though the world had shifted just slightly out of focus. The conversation flowed easily, their words weaving a tapestry of stories, questions, and tentative dreams. But as they walked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her gaze scanning the darkened streets. Nothing seemed out of place, yet an invisible thread of unease tugged at her. "Something wrong?" Oliver asked, noticing her hesitation. "It's nothing," she said quickly, though her fingers brushed against the celestial dial in her pocket, seeking reassurance. They turned a corner into a narrow lane, the dim light of a single street lamp casting long shadows. Ahead of them stood a figure, partially obscured by the glow. As they approached, Eleanor's heart sank. It was Adrian. "Back so soon?" Adrian's voice was calm, almost amused, but his expression was serious. "I wasn't expecting to see you here again so soon." Eleanor stopped short, her grip on Oliver's hand faltering. "What do you mean? I thought you said the moment was ours now." "It is," Adrian said, stepping closer. "But moments like these ripple outward. Every choice you make sends waves through time. Some waves are gentle, others are not." Oliver frowned. "What are you saying? That us walking together is somehow messing up the universe?" Adrian's gaze shifted to Oliver, his expression softening. "Not exactly. But you've entered a path that wasn't originally yours, Oliver. You're stepping into a story you weren't meant to know. And that comes with consequences." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of consequences?" Adrian hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out another watch, its face cracked and its hands frozen. "Do you know what happens when time breaks?" Oliver shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I'm guessing it's not good." Adrian held up the broken watch. "Time doesn't like to be rewritten. It fights back, and sometimes it doesn't fight fair." Eleanor's chest tightened. "But you said this was my choice, that there were no wrong answers." "There aren't," Adrian said gently. "But every choice has a cost." The celestial dial in her pocket began to vibrate, its warmth replaced by a sharp, insistent pulse. Eleanor pulled it out, watching as its hands spun wildly, faster and faster, until they stopped abruptly at 1:13 a.m. "What happens at 1:13? Oliver asked, his voice low. Adrian's expression darkened. "That's the point where the wave hits. The moment where time decides whether it will bend or break." Eleanor's heart pounded. "And what are we supposed to do? Just wait and see what happens?" Adrian shook his head. "No, you have to confront it, find the fracture, and make it whole. Only then can you move forward." Oliver looked at Eleanor, determination flashing in his eyes. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. You'll need each other." The world around them began to blur, the edges of reality dissolving into light and shadow. Eleanor felt Oliver's hand tighten around hers as they were pulled into a new scene. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the middle of a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath them shimmered like glass, reflecting an endless sky filled with stars. In the distance, a crack zigzagged across the ground, faint but unmistakable. A soft hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Eleanor took a step forward, the celestial dial glowing brighter in her hand. "That's it," she said. "The fracture." Oliver followed her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "Then let's fix it." As they approached the crack, the hum grew into a deafening roar. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air around them shimmered like heat waves. Eleanor felt the weight of the celestial dial in her hand, its warmth urging her forward. "What do we do?" Oliver shouted over the noise. Eleanor looked at him, her heart pounding. "We trust the dial, and each other." Together, they knelt before the fracture, the light from the celestial dial spilling onto the crack. Eleanor placed the watch at its center, the glow intensifying until it enveloped them completely. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a pulse of energy surged outward, and the crack began to mend, the jagged edges knitting together until the ground was whole once more. The light faded, leaving them standing in the quiet expanse. The celestial dial was cool in Eleanor's hand, its hands now pointing to 12. Oliver exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. "Did we just fix time?" Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with relief. "I think we did." Adrian's voice echoed around them, calm and steady. "Well done. The path is yours now." As the world around them began to shift back to the familiar cityscape, Eleanor glanced at Oliver, a sense of certainty settling over her. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Chapter 6. The Hands of Time. The city reformed around them, its familiar sights and sounds rushing back like a tide. Eleanor and Oliver stood on the street where their journey had begun, the faint glow of the celestial dial now extinguished. It felt different now, calm, as though the tension in the air had been lifted. Eleanor turned the watch over in her hands, its intricate design gleaming faintly under the street lamp. "It feels lighter," she said softly. Oliver stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her. "Do you think it's over?" She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not over. Just beginning." Adrian's voice lingered in her mind, his cryptic warnings still echoing. "The path is yours now." The weight of those words settled over her, but for the first time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like possibility. Oliver reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Whatever this is, whatever happens next, I'm in, Eleanor. No more questions, no more doubts. Just us." Her chest tightened, warmth spreading through her. "Me too," she whispered. As they began walking again, hand in hand, the city seemed alive with potential. Every street corner, every flickering light felt like a gateway to something new. Yet, as the quiet comfort of the moment settled over them, Eleanor felt a small, nagging thought prick at the edges of her mind. "Oliver," she said hesitantly, stopping in her tracks. What if this isn't the end of the ripples? What if there's more to come?" He turned to her, his expression steady. "Then we face it, together." She wanted to believe him, to let his certainty anchor her. But as she glanced down at the celestial dial, its once vibrant face now dull and still, a question lingered. What was the true cost of bending time? That night, they returned to Oliver's apartment, the quiet hum of the city fading into the background. Eleanor placed the celestial dial on the table between them, its presence both comforting and unnerving. "I think we should keep it safe," she said, her fingers brushing over its surface. Oliver nodded. "Agreed. But maybe we should also try to understand it. There's more to this watch than we know." Over the next few weeks, they delved into the mystery of the celestial dial, piecing together its history and purpose. They visited libraries, spoke to historians, and even returned to the clockmaker's shop, only to find it empty, as though Adrian had never existed. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the dial was watching them, subtly guiding their choices even when it lay untouched. There were moments when its glow would return, faint but unmistakable, as if reacting to something unseen. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Oliver turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "What if the dial isn't just about fixing time? What if it's about rewriting it?" Eleanor frowned. "Rewriting? You mean changing the past?" "Not just the past," he said, leaning forward. "The future, too. What if it's a tool for shaping what's to come, for giving people a second chance at the moments that matter most?" The idea sent a chill down her spine. That kind of power? It could be dangerous. Or it could be a gift, Oliver countered. if we use it wisely. Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of the vision she'd seen of her alternate life. The joy, the pain, the love. Would she change it if she could? The celestial dial glowed faintly, its hands shifting ever so slightly. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized it wasn't pointing to a specific time, it was pointing to them. Maybe it's not about what we can do with it, she said quietly. Maybe it's about what we choose to do, the choices we make now. Oliver smiled, his hand covering hers. Then let's make the right ones, together. As they sat there, the celestial dial pulsed softly, its light a reminder that time was theirs to shape, not through manipulation or control, but through the decisions they made in each fleeting moment. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet full of promise, and for the first time, Eleanor wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The celestial dial was quiet now, its work complete, but Eleanor knew its presence would remain, a silent witness to the lives they would build, one choice at a time. The hands of time had turned, and the path was theirs to walk.